Well, Cormac O'Malley is already familiar to most of us, or most of you in the room, as a long-standing Stonington resident and as a preserver and celebrator of the important achievements of his father, the militant Irish nationalist Ernie O'Malley, and his American mother, the photographer Helen Hooker. Cormac has been interested in Irish history and culture since his college days at Harvard and has long been active in Irish cultural activities in both the US and Ireland. Most of all, he has concentrated on his father's literary and historical accomplishments in co-edited volumes of Ernie's letters and military interviews, and in such works as Modern Ireland and Revolution, Ernie O'Malley in Context, Nobody's Business, Aaron Diaries of Ernie O'Malley, and I Call My Soul My Own, and as a co-author with fellow Stonington author Harry Martin's Ernie O'Malley, A Life. Cormac's most recent work, the one we're concentrating on and celebrating today, is The Enchanted Bay, Tales and Legends from Ernie O'Malley's first or Irish folklore collection. In this book, in the preface to the book, Dr. Christopher McCarthy suggests that its readers will, quote, will be surprised that it should come from the pen of a revolutionary and chronicler of Ireland's War of Independence struggles. But he notes that from his childhood, Ernie had been a folklore collector. As Cormac wrote, recapturing old Ireland was part of my father's lifelong ambition, especially expressing the ancient spirit of the Irish culture through stories. And as the work's co-editor, Patrick Mahoney writes, for O'Malley, the folk tradition was integral to the development of an independent Irish creative consciousness. In the Enchanted Bay, we find many kinds of folklore. There are fairy tales that might well remind us of those compiled by Perrault or the Grimms. There are legends, for example, apocryphal stories of St. Patrick's miraculous deeds. But most of all, the collection is made up of stories told from one generation to the next by the folk, the people, the ordinary people, especially of County Mayo. When we read them, we gain direct insight into that Irish creative consciousness.
Thank you, Millie. Thank you, Stonington Free Library. What a great place to celebrate books and have a book launch, and for friends who have come out. I'm just noticing a problem. I can't read my notes with my glasses on. Today you will be relieved to hear that I'm not going to cover the whole rich and glorious field of Irish folklore with its myths, legends, and tales. I'll keep it brief. I'll focus on how my illustrious militant father and author, General Ernie O'Malley, got involved with and played his role in capturing this collection of Irish tales and legends from the county of Mayo, as we say at home. I also mention the secondary role I played in bringing the project to fruition over the past 40 years. My father's memoir on the Irish Revolutionary period was called On Another Man's Wound and was published in 1936, telling of what his experiences had been through the rigors of the Anglo-Irish War. He starts that book, which is a history book, but he says that it's not a history book. And this is the way he starts it to prove that point. Our nurse Nanny told my oldest brother and me stories and legends. Her stories began, once upon a time, and a very good time it was, and ended with, they put on the kettle and made tea, and that it wouldn't, if you weren't happy, that you may. Tales of the kings of Ireland's son, his strange adventures and exploits, fairy tales about the good people, the story of the heavy-handed mighty Finn and his giant strength, the epic of Cuchulainn, the boy hero, of Ferdia of Connaught, whose loss was our loss, for he was from Erris in our county Mayo. That was the best of her tales. At the end of that first chapter, he was starting to tell what his experiences had been over 8 years of the revolution. And that's the way he started. And I think it's very meaningful that he chose to start it with his own background based in myths. And as a child, I know we heard Cuchulainn stories over and over again. So it was very meaningful to him. At the end of that first chapter, he goes on to write, an old woman told my fortune. She looked at my feet and my hands, and she told of fighting and trouble ahead. So, here he had had an experience by talking with his nanas. They would go around the fairs and things and had the gypsy tell his fortune. And in this case, you often wonder whether there are fairies and whether fortune tellers tell the truth or not. In this case, they got it right. Now, one question we must consider as we walk through all of these tales and legends is to ask, what is the underlying kernel of truth behind each tale? Quite often something did happen to someone or something, perhaps a long time ago, and the story of that event was passed along and on occasion embellished, for sure. In some of these tales, we hear people who tell of actual personal experiences, and you'll notice that the tone changes occasionally to the first person. So I want to say something about my father's background in Ireland and what folklore meant to him. You've heard how he decided to introduce himself through his book with the tale of his nanny. He also, when he was on the run in the IRA, going through 18 different brigades, he would hear the stories from the local people on what would be the time off. He didn't take too much time off. He was a hard worker. He wrote a lot of notes, but he would listen around the fireplace during the evening. And he heard of them. He also experienced, when he was up in Kildare, he had heard of, in the Bog of Allen, he challenged the legend of the black pig. He went out with a gun drawn and said, show yourself, Didn't show himself. I don't know what that proved to him, but it showed his attitude, first of all, to the existence of a folk tale, or in that case, a legend. In Donegal, one night he heard a wailing. He drew his revolver, got off his bike, tried to figure out what the noise was, tracked it down, again with the revolver drawn. So here you have an IRA character who's going out to investigate a legend, a noise, a fairy. What was it? Anyway, this was one of the incidents where he said he was just too scared. He put his revolver back, ran back, got his bike, and pedaled off. Now, actually, as he went around that corner, He didn't have a light because a policeman might see him. But he fell, jumped off his bike for some reason, and the bike went over a cliff. So next morning, he had to walk on that evening because he didn't have a bike. Now, another incident in terms of his of the folklore was when he went out to form an IRA company in the Aran Islands. Aran Islands are my wedding garment is from the Aran Islands, designed by Cormac O'Malley from Galway. And the men in the Aran Islands wear clothes like this, without buttons and fancied up, etc. But this is woven linen from the Aran Islands. He was out there in 1919 trying to organize a local IRA brigade. Didn't have much success, but he was a great success as a storyteller. Now, of course, I think part of the success of those stories were the translator, who was from County Clare, because the subject matter that my father was talking about were the tales of the German Till Ulstensberg, the English Halkut Sea Tales, Ulster's Briku Feast, and the Icelandic saga of Burnt Nile. Well, I mean, they were excited because these were new tales that my father, and who was only age 22 at this time, had learned and was able to recite. In those days, he just knew it by heart. He didn't have to go through reading as some of us occasionally do. Anyway, when he was writing his memoir, that first book that I mentioned, On Another Man's Wound, another element, he not only recalls folklore, but he includes 36 songs in the book. And I think that's a factor, that he wants to tell the story through legend as well as through song. When Father was over here in America, he had an experience in 1929 when he was out in Taos, New Mexico, and an Irish mystic and folklorist, Ella Young, had just spent the summer with George O'Keeffe, with Mabel Dodge Lohan in Taos, and Father dropped by in that September. And I have transcribed Father's diary of that first meeting, in which he talked to Ella, and he talks about the need that he should go back to Ireland to record Irish folklore and legends before the living storytellers disappeared. And I think that kernel of that discussion stayed with him, and when he had an opportunity, he did that type of activity twice. Once in a folklore, and second again when he recorded the stories, the actual stories of his comrades. And I've published a series of books about his comrades during the Irish wars. So how did these tales and legends really come about? My American mother married my father in 1935, and they went to live in Dublin. And after a while, they moved down to Mayo. And I was born while they were living in Mayo. They decided to build a self-sustaining farm where they only needed to buy tea, sugar, and some other things. I think that's a bit of a tale also, but it was a self-sustaining farm, and we had about 15 helpers help them. And of course, what do farmers do during the winter months? They're not really kept busy in the west of Ireland. So it was in the winter of 1940 that my father, over the course of a couple of months, started to meet up with over 30 local storytellers and wrote down about 330 tales. He had no formal folklore training, and he didn't speak Irish, but merely spoke to the lads and wrote down their stories as they told them. There were 12 notebooks in all, and I found them between 1984 and 2012. What was my role in all of this? The first thing I did was to get the tales transcribed, and that was difficult because my father's handwriting was incredibly difficult to read. And and thereafter I had other people help me transcribe, made a team of local people to get the right names, and got a co-editor, Patrick Mahoney, who helped me. So one aspect I had to consider as I was looking at these tales was how to employ the use of local words which my father wrote down phonetically. If I read those words in their original form, you would be listening to a form of Irish spoken in the 1940s by native Irish speakers born between 1860 and 1880, who had only learned English as they grew up, but most of their expressions and many of their words were actually retained in the old Irish form of speaking. So, I mean, the storytellers were in their 70s and 80s when he was catching them that winter. And their parents had lived through the famine. So some of these are about famine period, and they give a very personal story. In Irish, the first person is not used significantly. Most of the expressions come in the passive form. Most times the tales are told in the present tense with the use of he says and she says. I wanted to bring about a book which a local Mayo grandfather could read to his grandchild and that they would understand. To that date, I updated many of the original words, but I've retained them all in an index in the back. Some words which are easily understood, like drowned, not drowned, drowned, are retained as a reader can readily understand the meaning to which. But I mean, if you were to read, I ate the meat. I ate the mate. So it was translated in my book as he had to eat the meat because that you can understand it. What are these tales about, really? They really reflect the local people and what they talked about, what was important to them, what they remembered. For example, we've all heard something about fairies, but what are they? These tales, I think, explain events for which there is no rational explanation. There are tales such as about the mist coming down so that the fairy boats could go home without being seen. About the man who promised the fairy some of his crop if the fairy only gave him seed. The woman who got the wool woven by the fairy after making a promise to him. Another widow whose sons were drowned, was consoled because she had been so kind to the young men and girls in her village who had also been drowned. I'll explain a little bit more under each of the subjects as I go through. So the first subject is fairy tales, or as my father referred to them as the little people. Now, tales of the fairies abound in many countries, no doubt, and certainly all over Ireland. Little hillocks are often seen and have a hawthorn tree growing on top. We all know that the Fir Bolg, or the men of the bags, were defeated by the powerful Tuatha Danann, and so they retreated underground and live under the small mounds around Ireland. So woe betide to anyone who tries to remove a mound. British railway surveyors tried to draw straight lines for their projected railway tracks. But if they went through a fairy mound, the engineers would have to redraft the plans, as no workers would dig through a fairy mound. So the first one I want to read now is a little bit on that subject. It's called The Shadow That Changed the House. Once there was an old man Johnny from Island Edie, and he had a family of 4 or 5 girls and 1 son. His only son died, and he was greatly upset over the loss. Not long after that, one of his daughters, Maria, was going to Mass to Island Edie Chapel, and she fell over on the road. And I remember this myself, and she died immediately. Early on Sunday morning, Johnny had time enough to fix a gap in the fence that had been needed some repair before he was going to Mass. He was cutting rods to fix up the gap, and he seen the shadow of a boy, like his son, on the other side of the fence. And he was watching the shadow, not expecting that it would give him any information or anything, but the shadow spoke to him. "Father," said the shadow says, "you're in great trouble after Maria's death because your house is built in the wrong place. And you must make a new house in the track of the old drain where the water runs off the manure." Then the shadow disappeared. Johnny went home with this secret, went to Mass, and when he returned home, he went to work, building a new house exactly where he was told. Now, he wasn't very rich, and in order to get the money for his family, he went to the trouble of going to England to work on harvesting so that he could cover the expense of building. I met Johnny when he was working in England, and Johnny explained that the problem with the old house was that it interfered with the fairies passing the way, as the house was in their way on their own route. When Johnny was working on the new house, he'd dig 4 sods and call on the fairies to turn them around if they weren't in the right place. The father said the fairies do this in the right time at night. He wanted to make sure that there was no mistake and no humbugging in the future, for he knew that the fairies make humbug even in the middle of the day. So there's a real example now of somebody who had an experience, and fortunately he built his house in the right place and no one else died. A lot of these stories, you don't know the truth here, but I mean, this is a local reaction to something which had happened to him. Here's a second story, somewhat the same thing, and you get the gist of it. It's called "The Man Found Spread-Eagled on His Barn Roof." There was a mound out near Rochan, on the road near the village of Ahagower, about 300 yards from Ahagower Castle. There's a small little mound there, about 6 foot high, and on the top of it, there's a whitethorn bush, about 3 foot high. No one living remembers seeing if any smaller or any bigger. The whitethorn bush was never known to grow a leaf, but there was supposed to be a pot of gold under the little bush. Now, there was an old man by the name of Dennis Morn, who lived about 500 yards from the mound with the whitethorn. And one day he says to himself, I'd have a try for the pot of gold. In broad daylight when he was digging away, and he was doing fine indeed, until all of a sudden he was lifted up into the air, brought and landed spread-eagle on the roof of his own house. At that time, Dennis had a nice house, was a family man, and had 2 fine boys and 2 girls. But they were in great health. Within 6 months of his digging, all his children were under the daisies in Ahagower. So, I mean, there's another real-life experience of someone has reacted. I was fascinated by this because, I mean, the man is telling my father with this specific detail, 300 yards from Ahagower Castle. I mean, that puts it in a specific place, and of course, from the story, you get the time. Now, one of these tales, I was raised in what I call Clew Bay, And Clew Bay has 365 islands in it. And I have a book out there called Western Ways, which has photographs of a lot of the environment around Clew Bay. And one of the things that you see from the island stories are people who live there, who do their fishing or do their boating. A lot of deaths occur, drownings in the islands. They have very small, they come to town for the market on a day, and each of those issues create circumstances whereby stories can be told. Now, in this particular case, one of the elements in the seas are seals. And seals in the west of Ireland, they're not sacred like swans, but they're well known and you're supposed to treat them well. And if you don't, you can have a bad experience. So here is a story called The Flax Thrashers Under the Sea. Just before sunset one evening, there was an old man with his two partners, and they were out dredging oysters out by Inishballoch. The two men were pulling on their oars, and the third man was behind on the stern, holding on to the dredging rope, with the dredge down on the floor of the sea. Suddenly, the dredge got caught on the bottom. The dredger says to his comrades, "We have no dredge," meaning it was stuck below. "I'll have to go down on the rope and liberate it. It must be that it's stuck under a rock." He caught hold of the dredging rope and slipped down on it until, this is under the water, slipped down on it until it came to the bottom, to find that the dredge was caught under the threshold of a door. And the door was open. And the man looked into the house and saw that there was two men threshing the clefts of wheat and their wooden flails together on the floor. "God bless you. God bless your work," he says. "And you too," says they. "Ara, that you're welcome. I wouldn't have come down here at all," says he, "but the dredge was caught in the threshold at the door." He didn't really know where he was. He was so mesmerized. He went up to the fire, turned around with his back to the fire, and he's seen this toothless old man within the bed in the kayak built out from the wall. And he says, "What's wrong with you that you're not helping flail the straw and getting it right?" "I would indeed be flail," says he, "only for you." "What have I done to you?" says he. "So you struck me yesterday with an oyster shell," says he. "And I have this big gash on my forehead right over my eye. How could I do that to you?" "Well, do you remember the seal that was swimming around you yesterday evening? And you threw an oyster shell at him, and it stuck me here," he says, pointing to his head. "And that was me. Be going away with you now," says he, "and it'll be night before you get home, and don't be so fond of pelting at seals any more." The dredger liberated his dredge, and up the rope he went to his little boat. His partners thought he was drowned, that he was, when he wasn't coming up for so long. One of them says to him, "What took you so long?" "Well, I was in this house below," says he, "and there's two men threshing in it." And he told them the whole story. They wouldn't believe in him at all. Indeed, it was hard to believe such a story. So the dredger jumped out of the boat again, went down on the rope. He remembered that the lads had done their threshing below, and so found a sheaf of oats and brought it back up with him. The sheaf of oats proved his point to the men in the boat, and he threw the sheaf overboard. The next day, when he was going fishing, he noticed that the hens on Inishcottle were eating the oats that had floated ashore. Anyway, so enjoy your oysters, but don't throw the shells. So, as you can imagine, in Ireland, there's a dominant religion of Roman Catholic, and there's another tribe who invaded Ireland some years later. And there's always some contention between them, sometimes merely social, but sometimes with greater difficulty. So here's a story which is an unusual one, and it comes at the time of the famine, when it's a combination of someone who needs to feed his cattle, and he doesn't have land, and the question is what he does. It's called The Man Who Went to Church for His Cow. About the time of the famine, there was a man named Mickey in the parish of Louisburg, and he had a cow. He used to herd her on the roadside most of the time. One day, the local minister met him and started talking with him. "Don't you have any grass for the cow?" asked the minister. "Hardly any," says Mickey. "Well, you can, you can put your cow down in the glebe land below, if you'd like," says the minister. Glebe land would be where the church is. The man was absolutely delighted. He drove the cow down to the glebe each day so that she could graze there. After the fourth day, he met the minister again, and the minister says to him, "Michael, you must come to my church on Sundays, otherwise I can't give you the grass for your cow." "Oh, all right, your reverence," says Mickey, and went home. On the following Sunday, he was up early, went to the first Mass in the chapel, went home, had his breakfast, and went down to the church to the minister. That went on for a good few weeks. Then somebody complained to the minister that Mickey was going to the Mass every Sunday before he came down to the Protestant church. The minister says, "That can't be possible because I've seen him here every Sunday." But the man persisted and says to the minister, "I'll prove it to you that he's going to Mass, and if you come stand with me at such and such a corner each Sunday morning, you'll see him coming out from the chapel." The minister did so, and indeed saw Mickey coming out from the early Mass. He went over and spoke to Mickey and says, "Mickey, did you not tell me that you were going to come to my church?" "Oh, I did," says Mickey. "And now I see you coming from the chapel," says the minister. "Can you explain that?" "Oh, yes, Reverend," says Mickey. "I go to the chapel for the good of my soul. Then I go to your church for the grass of the cow." Another little incident which reflects on Irish local community, and some of you have seen the Quiet Man will remember the incident of a story quite similar to this. It's called The Borrowed Congregation. At one time, the Protestant minister of Louisburg, Reverend Seymour, was going to be removed elsewhere because his congregation was too small. It seems like himself and the parish priest, Father Pat Gibbons, were quite friendly and used to meet and walk down as far as the sea. One day the minister says to him, this will be the last time we'll walk together because the bishop is coming down to examine the congregation on Sunday, and I haven't much of a congregation, only a few." On the next Sunday came when the priest says, "I'll send down some of my flock if you are agreeable." On the next Sunday came when the people came into the chapel for Mass. The priest came around and he called out some of the men as he had selected them, McElvey, Durkin, and some others, and told them to go down and sit in the pews of the Protestant church. That was before Mass. When they went down after Mass, they filled up the pews. At the end of the visit, the bishop says to the minister, "Upon my honour, I've never seen such a finer congregation." And so the minister was left in his place, and the bishop went off satisfied with all that he had seen. There was only a few Protestants in the congregation at the time of Father Gibbons. So again, those are sort of some local facts and stories of not everything is bad in the local community, though sometimes it might appear. Now here's a story what I've put into a category called historic tradition. These would be real incidents that have occurred and have been recorded, but not too factually, though there's some specifics in here which might amuse you. Let me tell you what a faction fight is. A faction fight would be groups of people who usually collectively in a name who fight another people, as the story explains. It was not uncommon that faction fights would break out between certain loosely organized groups in the countryside. They happened around Louisburg area also, where there were faction fights between the Galanacs and the Granastones. In one of these fights with two sides using sticks, they went forward for a good while. Some of the wives had concealed their sticks under their coats when they were walking along. In one particular fight, a man was knocked out by a crack of a stick over his head. He recovered a little bit, but later died. The police arrested a good number of the participants and were able to identify one man to be charged with the killing. This assailant was prosecuted on a charge of murder. In his defense, he managed to get the services of a very clever lawyer. The lawyer asked the judge for and was granted permission to exhume the victim in order to have the skull examined by an expert. The expert was at the trial and swore that he had nothing against the deceased man, but he argued that the man's skull was abnormally thin and that it would have not taken much to break it. The expert noted that the crack of the stick in the fight would not have been a particularly heavy one. The judge turns to the accused. "What have you to say for yourself in defense?" "Well, your worship, I'll just ask you one question," he says. "What business has a man with a thin skull like that been in a faction fight?" The judge looks at him. "Well, if indeed he had a thin skull, then he had no business at all being in the faction fight. Case dismissed." Another group of stories relates to the Irish relationship with landlords. And the summary of it is not a very healthy one. Well, depending on whose sides. I mean, a lot of these stories, the landlord gets killed. And indeed, some of them are even traced to America, and they take care of them over here. So people have a long memory, and it's not necessarily. It's just the landlord has done very vicious acts to their tenants. So in this case, and the history of land. Just to give you a very brief, I should do a longer lecture sometime, but we'll skip 1169 and the invasion and the 16th century. But just quickly go into King James in 1603 brings plantation to Ulster. So basically in Ulster what happens is the Presbyterians are brought over and given the good land, and the Catholics are kicked off the land. Later on, Cromwell does the same thing, not for religious reasons, but to reward his soldiers. And so he draws up maps in counties and gives the officers certain land and other people different lands. Again, the Catholics are taken off. And the same thing happens again in the 1690s with the Flight of the Earls, when Irish chieftains' land is given away to people other than their clan members. So here there's a story of Dennis Brown, who's known, a near neighbor of ours. in Mayo. His name is actually Lord Sligo, and apparently he got Lord Sligo, which Sligo is about 50 miles, 80 miles away. And he got that Sligo title in a poker game. Anyway, Lord Sligo is living there, and he has been persuaded by his son to give up hanging priests and Catholics. Okay, very progressive. So this story is called Dennis Brown Had Bingham Do His Hanging. One day there was a young man walking across the Mount Brown farm, and Dennis Brown saw him and went over to talk to the gentleman. "What are you doing here?" says Dennis. "Oh, doing nothing much, sir, just walking around," says the young man. Dennis immediately took out some paper and wrote out a note and asks him, "Could you bring this letter to Mr. Bingham in Castlebar?" Perhaps Dennis thought the young man had seen him doing something that Dennis didn't want other people to know that he had done. Anyway, the man accepted the note and continued on his way. Now, the young man was a lazy man of sorts and didn't want to be bothered to go to Castlebar. It's about 14 miles away. But he met a man who said he was going to Castlebar. He asked the man if he would take and deliver Dennis's note to Mr. Bingham, so that he wouldn't have to have the bother himself. Perhaps he thought that it would be an honor for the other man to meet Mr. Bingham, or that he might get some reward for the delivery of the note. The other man took the letter and delivered it to Mr. Bingham. And Mr. Bingham hanged him. When he read the note, it said, "Hang the bearer." So, I mean, that shows the power of a landlord. He controlled the militia. He was head of the local militia. He was the chief magistrate in the local court. He was the largest landowner in the community. So people didn't feel like opposing a local landlord. One other story here is so that Bingham character that I refer to is in fact Lord Lucan. And any of you who have read Into the Valley of Death, Road the 500, that actually is an Irish land war story occurring in the Crimea. Lord Lucan sends the writer of the 500, who's a neighbor in Castlebar, whose land he wants to get. And should he die in battle, Lord Lucan can acquire that land. So, into the battle of death rode the 500 on Lord Lucan's orders in the Crimea War, a long way from Castlebar, but Lord Lucan solved his own problems that way. So he was, here's called Lord Lucan Plows the Hearthstones. A hearthstone is where you make your fire. It's usually a big stone, so it's solid with no cracks. And that's where you would build your turf fire and do your cooking over. Plows the hearthstones of Harima. Lord Lucan tried to get elected to Parliament in 1858. He'd been in the Crimea War in 54 and caused the slaughter of the Light Brigade. Owsley Higgins of James Street, Westport, beat him in the election, and some of the election officers told Lucan that the election was over and that he only got 3 votes in the little village of Attergower, near Castlebar on the Ballinrobe Road. Now, there were 47 homes in that village, and at the time only one man was the head of the house, had a vote. Catholics were given the vote in 1829 in Irish and English history. When Lord Lucan heard of his low tally in the village, he said he'd plough under the hearthstones of Aherdrina, and he kept his promise not too long after in 1859. It was on the 1st of November that Lucan's men gave notice of eviction of the people with the holdings in the village around Ahergahar, just as it was starting to get cold. Given what was going on generally in the area and because of the election results, the people were expecting that their evictions would eventually come. After that terrible day, until the day he died, one of the tenants from there spoke of Lucan, saying, "Bad luck to his bones in the ground." After his eviction, he moved to Glaspatrick. In Aherdrina, the houses weren't levelled if you put your furniture out of the house. It was yours to keep, but the house was levelled afterward. If you hadn't the furniture out, then they'd put the crowbars together and they'd be pulled down the roof on the side of the house on top of the furniture. The house of my grandfather, Pat O'Malley, lived in was the last house they knocked down because it was late in the evening. They left one room standing. When the brigade came down to the road with their work done, Pat O'Donnell of Castlebar, a bailiff for Lucan, stood on top of a little hill, looked right up, and he saw the one small room left standing. He immediately sent the brigade back up again, and they finished the day's work completely with not one house standing in the village. You know, a tough life. One other experience that happens during this period of the famine, there are people, and as you saw that little incident with the cow and the man, and we didn't have enough land, and having milk from the cow to keep the family was very important. Another thing was getting potatoes from the little acres of land that you could get. And if you didn't have enough land and you didn't get good potatoes, remember what happened in the famine, you were in a difficult spot. So sometimes there were people, what we call them, supers. And a super would be a lot of good meaning. Protestant ministers and services came from London to the west of Ireland, all over Ireland, and they established religious institutions, and if to try to get the Catholics to convert to their persuasion. And one of the things that you would get if you did so was you would get soup. And so people were known who made that transition were supers, S-O-U-P-E-R-S. And of course, 3 generations later in the west of Ireland, you'd still know, I know, sure, her family was a super, and it doesn't matter what, you know, even if they change religion back, you know, the memory stays on. That's called living memory in a community. So here is a girl is taken from the bird's nest. Grady of Clonahooer in Kilkeen married Mary McHale, a cousin of Grady's brother-in-law. He and his wife had a child, Maggie. They were so hard-pressed for food during the famine times that they talked about making plans for Maggie. They made arrangements in case it might be at the death of starvation to give Maggie to the bird's nest, a colony in Achill. They lived on a while after that, but not too long, they both died. Maggie was a fine, handsome young girl, and she went out to the bird's nest, as had been arranged. Now, Tony McHale, Mary's brother, was a small man, as was Mary, and was living along in Clonahooer. After Mary's death, Tony and some of the other family members went all the way over to Achill to Dugart to get Maggie out of the bird's nest colony. Tony had a plan, and he went to a local Catholic just near the colony and had someone from that house send in a message to Maggie asking her to come out with the message. When Maggie came out, Tony and his friends quickly seized her and took her off with them. Immediately afterward, followed by a drove of other jumpers who came out after Maggie to take her back to the colony. Tony fought them with their stick, And some other Catholic neighbours defended Maggie and fended them off. Tony brought the child to the convent in Westport, and later she went to America. As it happened, Tony had a holding of land in the lands near another colony located in Clapper Bridge over near Bunnahinch and near Killeen and Lewisburg. In spite of what Tony had done in taking Maggie away from the Achill colony, a man by the name of Rory gave a sworn statement to Lord Sligo, you've heard that name before, that Tony's holding was from a certain man and that a man had actually died, and therefore Tony would have to forfeit the land. Lord Sligo took a legal action against Tony based on the informer's evidence because he wanted the land to give to another jumper. In the end, Tony was thrown out of his land. However, a neighbour out of kindness gave Tony a conacre of bad land. He was able to sow there in late April, and later he had a good crop. Anyway, you know, these little tales make history and life so personal. I mean, whether they're measured in yards or religion or people taking action, I was remarkably thrilled to discover these and to have them published. So anyway, with that, that's the end of my remarks, but we have time for questions if anyone has questions. Now, who would you be?
What is a bird's nest colony?
The bird's nest colony was, in fact, there were several colonies in Achill that the Protestant ministries came out. That was its name. They were actually called colonies because they bought local land, they did their veggies, they took in former Catholics, they gave them the soup, they worked the land, and you know, they stayed there. So I don't know, in Dugert there's a very famous church, Protestant church, as well as a small house beside it. So I don't know whether that house actually, I've never heard it referred to as bird's nest, but clearly there's a depiction of it. A commune. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, they took good land, and they came with money, not great money. I mean, they were ministers, but their effort was to proselytize, and so by getting people to come join them, they had more manpower, or girl power, or whatever, and they went out and made better land out of the. And those lands in the west of Ireland are pretty poor because God didn't give them much soil, or good soil. So they needed money to put whatever phosphate and other things they could, which the local farmers couldn't get. And so they did well. And you can see, as you go through Achill today, just around the corner from that church is what's called the deserted village. And you can see the ruined houses from the 1840s and the famine years, where people went to America just to get out of there. Yeah.
Are these stories, it's like individuals passing on the stories, or is these ones that other people are telling, and they seem very like local and personal, but are these stories that existed just in Mayo, or are they told in other, like what's the reach? Now it's going to be around the world because of this book, but in the oral tradition, like what was the...
Well, there are several categories within the oral tradition. There would be the classic legends of Cuchulainn and Tuatha Danann and all of that. I mean, these are the equivalent of the Irish Greek myths. And those, you know, my father, your grandfather was telling me as a child, and I still remember in fair detail his telling of that Táin Bó Cúailnge, it's called, the invasion of Ulster, ironically, by a Mayo man, Mayo woman, I should say, and fighting for the Bull of Ulster. But there are, and the Fianna, these are legends of war. Throughout Ireland, there's a series of books that I looked at. So you have tales and legends of Mayo, Galway, Kerry, Cork. So they're very local ones. These had just happened to be 30 storytellers that my father met and recorded what their tales were. Some of them are what you call international tales, the Gubon tales, which are too long to read. In a little thing like this, fascinating tales. But the master is a series whereby a carpenter, the Gubon, which is the Irish word for a carpenter, goes and builds a castle for somebody, and the landlord, as usual, is not very kind to the Gubon and threatens him, kidnaps his son, and the Gubon, and the good thing is some stories always have a highlight, outsmarts the master and kidnaps the master's son. And so there's an exchange, and the money is paid. He's gotten whatever money he was due. But in the theme is that it's not the master, it's the junior fellow who does the work who outsmarts the master. So, but I was intrigued by these because certainly about 20 of these tales are told in the first person. And one I didn't tell, which is so compelling, is he remembers as a 5-year-old in 1868, his mother, who had survived the famine, lived on Lord Sligo's estate. Lord Sligo's landlord, land agent, came down, and he remembers their being removed from the house and the latch being locked. And he had this memory as a 5-year-old, and he tells that story I'm sure he told it to others before Father caught it in 1940. But it was so rewarding to be able to capture that and have that be part of local history. So, there were some good landlords, but mostly you don't hear too much good stories about the landlords. Anyway, yes, young man.
Sir, are there any stories or tales in particular that you recollect that show the link between Ireland and America, specifically, perhaps from the founding time or thereafter?
Well, when you buy the book and you look up America in the index, which I did make up, you will find the number of references to America. So some of the stories are Irish. There's a story about the young man who becomes a doctor, and he goes to England, and then he goes to America, and he makes his money, he comes back, and somebody else has a he cheats. He cheats too good. There's a dowry is one of the things that comes up in English and Irish history, and he got £10 off, and the woman had to pay the dowry to the man. So he got £10 off 2 girls. Well, in a village you can't keep a secret, and they found out about it. And they went to the parish priest, and the parish priest was asked, what should we do? And he didn't know what to do. So sadly, the story is the man took off with America with the £20, but he becomes a very successful person and comes back to Ireland with his wife and his in-laws. So there are many stories. I mean, there's another story where the beholder remembers the ship anchoring off Clare Island and the boat coming out from Westport. And this would have been about 1862, because you got a pass. You would know about passes if you joined the Union Army. So here was literally a ticket to America, and once you came down the steps in Boston or New York, you got your assignment and went off to fight. And of course, the Irish Brigade and things like that. So there are many, America comes up regularly. Not too many people come back, but some do. And it's always in a positive light. Yes, Stuart. No, is that no, Tom?
Cormac, once when I was driving up to Ashford Castle in Mayo, I saw 16 rainbows at one time. Do you have any stories about rainbows?
Now that's a fairy story in itself, Tom. No, but I do remember when on one of my occasions I was in Dublin with some American colleagues, and for those of you who've read Harry Martin's book on my father, the Civil War plays a big role, and particularly the Irish, the four courts. Four mean F-O-U-R, where the four courts met, and they were across the street in the Liffey. And I was showing people out with great pride, and on that particular day, there were 2 rainbows. I mean, I've never heard of 14 rainbows, so that's definitely a suspicious story. But there were 2 rainbows over Dublin landing on the forecourts. And, I had my friends come out, and they said, what are we looking at? I said, well, number one, there's 2 rainbows, but they're all pointed to the spot that I wanted to show you. I mean, what like rainbows, the pot of gold under the rainbow, but anyone who follows the rainbow finds it pretty hard to find it. And depending upon how many hills you cover and go up and down, sometimes it disappears. But people have made songs about them, and even Broadway shows about them. But no, I've never. There are none really in here. But there are stories about, the leprechaun, who has the gold. And there's a great one called 3 Wishes, which is really good. So read that one first, the three Wishes. Yes?
It sounds like there were a lot of stories to go through in transcribing and translating. How did you decide which ones were going to go in the book?
Good question. Now, if you knew anything about, as Harry Martin does, about my father's handwriting, you would say, well, let's see, out of the 330, how many make sense in terms of can we complete the writing? And so that came down to about 150. And I got my friends in Mayo who I had been visiting on a regular basis. And I said, let's read all of these. Actually, I got up to about 200. Let's read all of these and grade them 1 to 5. 1 would be nonsense. 2 would be what's called in folklore or other languages a gazetteer, mere information. Sun rises at 10. Fair days are on Tuesdays and Saturdays. Not of interest. And so then I was really left with 3, 4, and 5. 3 was a starter, but did not finish. 4 was good, but not complete. And 5 was finished. So even when I got to the finished ones, there were more than enough. And so I went with those. And in the back of the book, I have all the footnotes as to where all of them are, if any scholar or folklorist wants to do the rest of my work. Yes, Harry.
As one who went through the challenges of writing about a co-author's mother and father, and if you don't think that's a challenge, just try it. I have a congratulation for you, my dear fellow, and that is you have taken on, after 20 or 30 years about writing about each parent in depth, an intense effort to go into the culture from which they came, to describe why they were the way they were, particularly your father, because of course Helen came from the Greenwich culture of wealth, which is quite different. And so I think you achieved a remarkable situation of getting readers to be interested again in Ernie O'Malley because of the diverse and fascinating folklore stories that created his world, and therefore, I advise everyone in this room to go home with a copy of this. It's not enough to come and listen to somebody talk about their book. Buy the bloody book and take it home.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you. So with that, I should go to the back and follow.
Here, here.
Okay. Come on down. Thank you, love. Thank you.
By